recording. Recording in progress. There we go. All right, let's do it. Soak it up. Soak Torah. Soak it up. Soak it Torah. Soak it up. Soak it up. Soak Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. All right, so welcome back. Those of you wondering, the landscape behind me, that is from the Sinai Peninsula. That is what's known in Arabic as Jabal Musa, which according to some traditions is Mount Sinai. There is a monastery at the foot of that mountain, Santa Caterina Monastery, which I went to when my nifty trip to Israel many years ago. The Sinai Desert was still technically part of Israel. It had not yet been returned to Egypt. So we spent some time in the Sinai Desert, which was very cool. And we climbed up Jabal Musa to watch the sunrise. In the middle of the night, we climbed up and watched the sunrise up there. So anyway, so I wanted to start today just by kind of reorienting ourselves and zooming out, as I'm fond of doing in a Hoffman kind of sense, and especially since for those of you that participated in the Tu B'Shvat Seder this Sunday morning, I introduced a whole new group of people, including our religious school, to the four worlds concept, because that Seder was very much based on the four worlds. So we're looking at a model of Jewish liturgy and an understanding of Jewish prayer from this model borrowed from the classical understanding of the world, the four worlds, of which there is a physical, an emotional, an intellectual, and a spiritual world. And we spend most of our time in the physical, of course, but those other three worlds are important. That's why you're here, taking time out of your Wednesday morning, 10:30 a.m. to talk about liturgy, because you want to have a closer connection to this sort of thing. They correspond to the four elements of classical understanding: earth, water, air, and fire. And as we've seen so far in our exploration of the Siddur, the first four rubrics of prayer in a morning service closely parallel those four worlds. In the beginning, the Birkot HaShachar, the morning blessings, they are extremely physical in nature, including a blessing for openings and closings, and keeping the things that are supposed to be open, and keeping the things that are supposed to stay closed. Or as in the Torah of Josh from London, what was a prayer for the morning poo? So we have very physical blessings at the very beginning of the service. Then we move to Sukkei de Zimra, Psalms of Praise. And as we mentioned, Psalms are very emotional. I have no knowledge of any psalm that you could say that you would respond to if someone asked you how you were and you wanted to quote a psalm text, like, I'm all right. I mean, I guess I'm okay. It's like, no, there are extremes of emotional states, whether extreme despair and extreme sadness, or the other way around, and these are the ones in the Siddur in the morning, psalms of praising God just extensively and just enthusiastically. And so that's our emotional section of the service. Most recently, we've been looking at the intellectual world, that section of the service, which is probably more familiar, at least if you grew up in a Reform context. Although I have to remind myself, even those who did grow up in a more traditional context, in a more conservative or Orthodox background, might not be all that familiar with those first two sections of a service. because if you go on Saturday morning and the service starts at 9 and Birchot HaShachar is starting at 9, you're not going to show up at 9 o'clock. If you're at a conservative congregation, the only people that show up at 9 o'clock at a conservative congregation on Saturday morning are non-Jewish friends of the bar mitzvah of the morning who don't understand that when they say 9 o'clock, it's like, well, really the action is really going to start till like 10:30 or so. And people wander in. So, but certainly this section that we've been looking at most recently, Shema Uvirchotecha, the Shema and technically in a gendered sense, her blessings, is more familiar. There's a tendency within some Reform worship, which I would humbly maintain kind of short circuits the whole process of you come in for a morning service, morning service at 10:30, and you have an opening song, usually Ma Tovu or something like that, an opening reading, and then boom, right to Baruch. It's like, but we've just skipped 2 major sections of worship and 2 kind of warm-up sections where we get into a place where we're ready to consider the intellectual implications of this portion of the service. So we've explored Yotzer Or and Ahava Rabbah, the morning iterations of the prayers for creation. God as creator, and that's again in present tense. And then the second prayer as God as the revealer of divine law, God as the God who loves us, and as a demonstration of this love, gives us laws to live by. And as Rabbi Hoffman taught years ago, and I have hopefully been imparting in my own humble way, these prayers can be looked at as a critique of other philosophies and other faith traditions from about 2,000 years ago, and a way of, as Rabbi Hoffman likes to say, censoring in and censoring out, saying this is what we believe and this is what we do not believe. And so the Yotzer Or, we praise God as creator of both light and darkness, as opposed to the dualists of the time, primarily Zoroastrians, who believed in a God of light and a God of darkness, 2 separate gods who were in constant state of warfare with one another. And Judaism says, no, that's not what we believe. We believe in one God, and that God is both the God of light and of darkness. We do not believe in 2 separate gods in that way. Ahava Rabbah, and its evening parallel, the Ahavat Olam, takes on the issue of love as it relates to law, and early conservative or early Christian proselytization emphasized the fact that you don't need to worry about following all these laws that Judaism has. All you need to do to achieve salvation is to believe, is to love Jesus. And Judaism said in its response to that proselytization technique that no. These laws that God give us are in fact an expression of God's love, because he wouldn't be around for another 1,500 years or so. But it was Hobbes, I believe, who said life in the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. I think that was Hobbes. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I think that was him.
Hobbes the lion? Hobbes the tiger? No. Hobbes the tiger?
No, not Hobbes the tiger. Different Hobbes. Anyway, so we get to the centerpiece of this section of the service, which is Shema, and we have to define our terms a little bit here. For many Jews, if I refer to saying the Shema, your immediate thought would be the 2 lines. The one that says Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, and then the Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, which is not from Torah. But in rabbinic literature and the rabbinic understanding, Shema includes the paragraph that continues after that line, after that first line from Deuteronomy 6. And then another section, in Deuteronomy a little later. And then finally, a third section from the book of Numbers that our prayer book has part of, but not the entirety of, and we'll look at why and how this came about in just a little bit. So when rabbinic literature talks about Shema, they mean this larger form as opposed to Shema and what we would then refer to as Ve'ahavta. I think part of this is just a matter of well, as it says in Shema, Vishinantam Lavanecha, you will teach them to your children. Well, kindergartners and first graders can learn to say Shema. They're not going to be able to learn all of Ve'ahavta. That comes later in Hebrew school. So I think that's part of where that division comes from. But technically it's all part of the same prayer. And we've got this fascinating statement in Deuteronomy 6, which I will actually don't have a slide to put up here, but for those of you that do have Mishkan Tefillah, I do have slides that I will put up for the full text of Ve'ahavta, which is not found in Mishkan Tefillah. But for those of you that have a Siddur, or in the morning service, page 64, 65. I really like what they did with the graphics on this in Mishkan Tefillah. And you've got this 2-page spread with Shema arcing over both pages. And the lettering is in a Torah style kind of font there, since it is a Torah quote from Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. And we get this phrase, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. So a statement, I grew up in a Reform context. I grew up with a rabbi solemnly intoning, either we've been standing or we rise again for the watchword of our faith. And I was never exactly sure what that meant when I was a kid. I just knew that it sounded really important. And this statement of the oneness of our God, and reflected in a couple of different ways, one of which, when written in Torah, and sorry, Pat, I didn't get your chat there. Yes, Thomas, yes, okay, good, I was right, thank you for checking me on that. So when written in a Torah scroll, and when you see it, the last letter of the first word, the ayin of Shema, and the dalet of Echad, the very last letter, are written enlarged. And the tradition, the understanding is that these words especially are said very carefully, and the letters themselves are enlarged, because together, when you put them together, the ayin and the dalet form the Hebrew word aid, meaning witness. And I get a witness. And therefore, when a Jew says Shema, God, that we are acting as witnesses to the rest of the world, to the oneness of God, to the oneness of creation and the oneness of our God. And it's important that these letters are enlarged, one commentary says, because an ayin is a silent letter. And I will be the first to admit my Hebrew spelling is atrocious. It is awful. It always has been. And I empathize with folks who learn English as a second language and try to learn to spell English when it's so counterintuitive and so ridiculous in so many places. But for myself, I am constantly confusing alepphs and ayins. I am constantly missing whether or not something is a kaf or a kuf. And my Hebrew spelling has always been just wretched. I try and double check myself very carefully before I actually put anything out there. But if you were to misspell these letters, okay, you could, and get the same sound out of them. You could get Shema, okay, with an aleph, which would mean perhaps, maybe, Yisrael, you Jewish people. Adonai is our God. Adonai. Now, the Dalet, of course, bane of many early Hebrew readers and bar and bat mitzvah students, can sometimes be very difficult to discern whether or not the letter is a Dalet or a Resh, which is very, very similar in shape. I see Anne nodding her head in agreement there, because yeah, that's a tricky one for lots of kids. And if that were to be rendered as a resh, it would become the word acher, meaning other or another. So you could misread this horrifically and say, Shema Yisrael, maybe Israel. Adonai is our God. Adonai is another of gods, of the various gods that are worshipped out there. So that would be a no-no. That would be missing the point of that line. And so it's very carefully written out in the Torah. And the understanding is that you carefully say each word. And in fact, there is a tradition that you elongate the dalet at the end of echad. Part of that comes from a story about pleasant little story about the execution of Rabbi Akiva by the Romans, who, as he was being tortured to death, said the words of Shema and stretched out that word echad as much as possible with his final dying breath as he was killed by the Romans. I've brought in the meditative practice of having each word of Shema be its own independent breath, which I have found is a very powerful experience. It's a little challenging when you're wearing a mask and when we're in the sanctuary masked. But when I first experienced that, it's like, oh yeah, this is definitely the way to say Shema. This will definitely focus your attention. Again, those of you that grew up in traditional context, the understanding is that Shema, you say it and you cover your eyes to assist in your concentration there, and this just becomes another way of doing that. I wanted to share with you a reading from one of my teachers. A dear friend of mine that I did the Jewish Meditation Kala in Prescott, Arizona in the early aughts with for a number of years, and has been one of my mentors. He was really one of the first people to look into this idea of can you meditate Jewishly, and we've talked some about this in the course of this class, that there is a mystical tradition within Judaism, and which includes a meditative tradition. The Yordei Merkava mystics, who were responsible for a big chunk of the traditional Yotzer, the part that's not in our prayer book, which goes on and on and on and on, and content-wise isn't all that interesting, but the mantra effect of the repeated words and so on, they were clearly engaged in some kind of meditative practices. And we know this from certain fragments in the Talmud of what they would do. But it wasn't mainstream. It wasn't mainstream Judaism. It certainly wasn't in the 60s and 70s. And lots of Jews left North American Judaism because they just weren't finding what appealed to them in the very formal sanctuaries and very dignified rituals that marked classical reform and conservative Judaism of the 60s and 70s. They weren't finding it, and so they turned eastward. And there were a number of Jews that went to live on an ashram and proceed to meditate. And you've got a comment, please.
Yeah, well, that very formalized style had a different purpose, though.
Yes.
I mean, the purpose was to almost like a bridge more for assimilation and to prevent leaving Judaism in a different way.
Yes.
So, rather than just wholesale bugging out, it was, oh no, wait, let's kind of make it more churchy, so you're more like everybody else. And then for some people, as you were saying, that was just too stark, and people didn't fear being different anymore by that time. So they were ready to, they didn't want to put on frock coats anymore, but they were willing to they wanted to stay Jews, but they didn't want to stay Jews like that anymore.
Correct. And I've spoken about that as well. The original purpose of Reform Judaism as it began in Central Europe and then as it was imported into America was to demonstrate that we could be just as civilized and just have just as much decorum and high culture as our Christian neighbors could. So, okay, they've got an organ, we'll get an organ. They've got a 4-part choir, we'll get a 4-part choir. We can do this. It reached a point in the foment of the times of the late 60s and early 70s, where that style of worship was no longer appealing, particularly to younger people, and in the hotbed of what all was going on in the 60s, and that's not what they were interested in. At about this time, I'd also mentioned, I think I mentioned the what became known as the first Jewish catalog, the kind of do-it-yourself Judaism book, which I remember poring over just passionately as a young kid. I think I got a copy for my bar mitzvah, and it was just like, wow, you can like make your own talit, and you can tie your own tzitzit, and here's the instructions, and spell it out. This is how you build a sukkah, and so on. A lot of this change in America at the time, of course, came as other groups within America started to reject the notion of assimilation and fully embrace an idea of their unique identity. And remember, in the late 1960s, you started to get a Black Power movement, and this notion of no, we are proud of our ancestry, and we are not going to hide it anymore. And I think a lot of that filtered into Judaism, because especially in the 40s and 50s, if you wanted to make it in American society, in certain aspects of American society, number one, don't have too Jewishy sounding a name, because certain places are not going to hire you. Doesn't matter how good your work is, you're not going to get hired because obviously too Jewish. And so the ideal was in the 40s and 50s, especially, that America it was finally a place where it was possible to assimilate. And back in those days, and we have to put ourselves in that frame of mind, assimilation was not a bad word. It became an insult in the late 60s and the early 70s. If you were assimilating, that meant you were denying the culture that you came from. I've done a number of programs, both for adults and teens, and I'll probably do an intergenerational program. Hopefully one of these days, if we can ever get back in person again and do religious school in person. But there've been a number of books written of late. Beth Ann, you gave me one version on these things, but a lot's been noted that the unique genre of the American superhero, most of them were created by first-generation American Jews. Their parents were immigrants. They were born in America, but were raised as Jews. And yet, look, the Superman story. Okay? Mom and dad put him in a little rocket to save him from Krypton's destruction there, and he goes and ends up in a different place and raised by two people that aren't his parents, but and he knows he's different. It's like, it's such a riff on the Moses story. Come on, it's just right there. But there's a fascinating book, and I'll do this program because it's fun. It's fun. It's cool. But there's a book whose title, do I have it here? I think it's at the office. There's a book that's called Disguised as Clark Kent. And the thesis of the book, which I thought was brilliant, was that, yes, Jews were responsible for the creation of many of the classic American superheroes. Superman, a couple of Jewish boys, Captain America, that most American of heroes of all, Joe Sinnott, and Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, who used to be known as Stanley Lieber, that was his birth name. He said once in an interview he was saving Stanley Lieber for when he finally wrote the great American novel, and he didn't want to sully that name with the fact that he was writing comic books for kids. But they created all of the superheroes, the great superheroes of Marvel of the 1960s, which have now become ridiculously huge budget movies. Some of them actually pretty good movies. I maintain very strongly that Black Panther is not just a good superhero movie. It's a good movie. It's a really good movie. One person critiqued it and said, well, yeah, but it is kind of a ripoff of The Lion King. And I said, you're right. And you know what else? They're both ripoffs of Hamlet. I mean, if you're going to rip off good source material, you go to the best. Go to the absolute best. So the back to this book, Disguised as Clark Kent. The thesis of that book was the important part of the Superman story was not that he was an alien from another planet and had great superpowers and would fight for truth, justice, and the American way, and so on, which I understand is now being changed to be a bit more inclusive. Good for DC. But the important part of the Clark Kent story, at least for of the Superman story for Jews, was the fact that he was Clark Kent. And as Clark Kent, and all jokes aside about, okay, yeah, he takes off the cape, puts on a pair of dorky glasses, and no one recognizes him. Gosh, nobody can tell. I've written a Purim spiel, which I'm sure we'll do at some point, a superhero parody Purim spiel. And there's an ongoing gag that Esther, who is, her secret identity is Batwoman, the only costume change she has when she's Esther versus when she's crime-fighting Batwoman is she puts on a pair of glasses and nobody recognizes her. But the point of that was that Clark Kent was employed by the Daily Planet and was working successfully as a reporter in Metropolis there. And yeah, Lois Lane wouldn't give him the time of day because she only had eyes for Superman. Lois, it's like, hello, Lois, you can't tell the difference between these two. Thank you, Mark. But the idea was that Clark Kent was the Jewish dream of making it in America. He had successfully assimilated. Yes, he was an alien. Okay? He was the other. But when he was in his Clark Kent form, nobody knew. He had disguised himself sufficiently that he was able to pass. He was able to pass as an Earthling. And for so many Jews in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and so on, that was their most ardent dream. That was what they most wanted to do, is change your name and work, hopefully get into a good college where, of course, there were quotas for the number of Jews that were allowed to attend, and then hopefully get a good job in some industry that wouldn't hire Jews, but if you were good enough and disguised enough, then they might hire you, and then you move out to Long Island and get a little house with a white picket fence. And that was the Jewish dream of the time. Patty, yeah.
Yeah, they had quotas in a lot of organizations for how many Jews were allowed, because we had to say our religion. There was none. Atheism would be like just grow some horns and a tail, and try to mix that way. So, I was thinking, well, why didn't they just say none, or I do not wish to reply? Back in those days, you couldn't. That was
Not an option.
Not an option.
Good point.
You either had to lie or you had to take the consequences of society's attitude. Yeah.
My mother applied for a job at an elite girls' school in Chicago when she got her teaching degree. And she filled out all of the academic credentials when she went in for her interview and all the paperwork. And when she filled out the personal part of the application, it asked for her grandmother's maiden name.
Ooh.
And as soon as she saw that, she got up and walked out, because she knew what they were looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Irish or Jewish.
Yep. Lori.
My dad, who many of you knew, never wanted to be a doctor. He wanted to be a chemist, but he knew that being Jewish, that would leave him in some company the ability to fire him and discriminate against him because of his religion, which is why he became a doctor. Yeah, and I know I think my brother had applied to Harvard, but the quota was full for Jews, so he didn't go. And that happened to a lot of kids.
Yeah. And it's something that, one reason I like teaching about the Jews and superheroes thing is, number one, most kids are, excited and interested in hearing about it. It's like, oh, this sounds interesting, as opposed to much of what we do in religious school. But the other part of it is that most kids don't realize what life was like in the mid 20th century for Jews, even safe from the horrors of Europe in the middle of the century. That there were still some major major discrimination and anti-Semitism, which unfortunately is still with us in this day and age. And
it's happened here in Waukesha County. We've had to intervene in some of our in one of our Lake Country school districts that we know of.
Yeah. Anyway, so where we got onto this tangent, and it's a good tangent, it's an important tangent, was that the corporate Judaism of the 50s and 60s, which, and you're absolutely right, served an important function back at the time. It's just things started changing so rapidly in the 60s that a number of young kids wanted nothing to do with what was going on there, and so they were far more interested in spiritual practices of the East, and so went to an ashram and got a mantra and started meditating and so on. My teacher, Ted Falcon, in the mid 1970s, he was doing the whole altered states, lie in the tank of salt water, is sensory deprivation tank kind of stuff in the mid 70s, and ultimately made his way back to Judaism. Rabbi Ted Falcon, and he wrote this, and so I wanted to share it with you. He said, "One day, as was my custom, I opened a traditional prayer book to discover what passage might randomly emerge." And that's a common meditative practice. You take a sacred text and you either find a word that jumps out of you or a phrase or something, and you meditate on it. The page I opened to contained the words of the Shema. I almost closed the book to try for a different passage because those 6 Hebrew words, listen, Israel, the eternal is our God, the eternal is one, are perhaps the most central and well-known in Jewish tradition. But my first thought was that they could offer me nothing new. But something told me to take time to contemplate these words as if I was meeting them for the first time. I told you all my story about Ted Falcon and the Meditation for Dummies book. Have I told you that story? Okay. First time meeting Ted Falcon in person. All down, in a van going from the Phoenix airport on the drive up to Prescott. And we had phone meetings, Skype and such didn't exist. So we had phone meetings. We talked with one another, and we knew who one another was. It was the first time meeting one another. And all of us kind of in the back of our mind in the bus as we're talking about what we're hoping to do in this coming week with this Jewish meditation Kala, and 120 people registered for this thing. It was insane. But in the back of our minds, all of us thinking, is this going to work, or is this going to be one of the greatest train wrecks of the URJ ever? That we're getting a bunch of Reform Jews together to teach them Jewish meditation. Are we out of our minds? So we're in the van and we're going up, and then at some point on the ride, Ted Falcon pulls out the oh so ubiquitous book series from the 90s. He pulls out a copy of Meditation for Dummies with that yellow and black cover that all those books had. And the rest of the faculty just kind of looked. And I forget who it was who finally had the courage to say, Ted, you're one of the foremost practitioners of Jewish meditation today in the world. You've been seriously practicing meditation for 25 plus years. Why do you have a copy of Meditation for Dummies? And Ted Falcon smiled, this kindly grandfatherly smile that he has, and he looked at us and he said, it reminds me of how little I actually know. So that's the Torah of Ted Falcon and Meditation for Dummies. So his comment there about contemplate those words as if I was meeting them for the first time. So the words immediately following those words proclaim that these words, the Shema, shall be upon your heart. And that's Deuteronomy 6, verse 6. I recall that heart in the biblical idiom was not the organ associated with feeling. It was the organ associated with thought, with the mind. And we have this dualistic idea of the head and the heart that comes to us mostly from Christian Middle Ages and that separation of the heart as the seat of the emotions and our brain being the seat of our thought. But in the biblical context, lev, which technically, yes, meant the organ, the heart, but that meant your intellect, that meant your thought. Okay? So I recall that heart in biblical idiom was not the organ associated with feeling, it was the organ associated with thought, with the mind. It was as if the sentence said, these words shall be upon your mind. The text then says the 6 words are to be repeated when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. In other words, that's all the time. It suddenly struck me that these were a clear instruction for meditation practice, a Jewish meditation practice, the first that I had found. So that's Ted Falcon's riff on Shema as being a meditative focus. So we have this first line, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, And then I have to remind myself, especially when I do double headers on Friday night, and I've done the conservative congregation first. It's like, okay, conservative congregation, don't say the Baruch Shem line out loud, don't say it. And then when I do our service, it's like, okay, remember to say it. Don't not say it, because I'm just noticing there are birds out on my balcony. It's like, it's ridiculously cold out there, okay, but that's kind of cool. There's some birds sitting out there on my balcony. Sweet, should get a bird feeder out there. And we then get this line, which is not from Torah, this Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'en line, which is, as Rabbi Hoffman says, it's an unabashedly, unequivocal praise of God, or as in theological terms, it's a doxology. Okay, it is a complete, total praise of God. Blessed is God's glorious majesty forever and ever. Okay. Now,
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always wondered what that word meant, doxology, because I've heard that in a Protestant context, but I don't know what that term means.
It's a statement of absolute belief, I think.
Okay.
Now, somebody can check a dictionary definition, but for these purposes, it's a statement of in Jewish case, praise and just absolute faith and belief. So there's a Midrash, there's a story that, and the argument about whether or not to say this line after Shema or not, and how it got into the prayer book. There's Midrash that Jacob, when he's down in Egypt and finally reunited with all of his sons, and they're in this place that is not their land, and the place that they've been promised, they're not there now because famine. And he gathers together his sons on his deathbed and gives the rather odd blessings that he gives, some of them. And it's like, gee, thanks, Dad, I think. But the understanding was that his concern was, and it's articulated in Torah, his concern was that once he dies, that his sons will lose track of their specific destiny and go and become Egyptians and so on. And so he entreats them and he says, promise me, boys, promise me that you will keep the faith. And the story goes that they respond to him in unison, Shema Yisrael, listen, Israel, which was Jacob's other name. It's used interchangeably throughout the rest of the book of Genesis, even after his name gets dramatically changed after the wrestling match. Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. And then the story goes, the Midrash says, that Jacob says, with his final words, he says, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam. Blessed be the name of God, now and forever. Blessed be God's glorious majesty now and forever. Beth Ann.
It's because a lot of congregations do it. I've been paying attention since you've come here, because some do it loudly.
Mm-hmm.
And then we are doing it softly, which I've also done. So I thought I might bring that up.
Yeah. So there was an argument in terms of, number one, whether or not it should be included in the prayer book at all, because we're quoting Torah. And the next line, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, is a continuation of Deuteronomy chapter 6, which started in verse 4 with Shema Yisrael, and then Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha is the next verse. Okay, so whether or not to include it at all, and then the second debate was whether or not to say it or not. And in classic Jewish form, and I love it when our tradition does this, you've got an argument that cannot be really decided. And on the one side, it said, well, it's not in the Torah, therefore it shouldn't be in the prayer book. And then another side, and you've got, but the story of Jacob, our forefather, and how can we disrespect him in that way by not including these words? So what the tradition became was they put the words in the prayer book, they just didn't sing it out loud. So there was pause, we say it quietly. And for those of you that are familiar with an Orthodox or a conservative service, it's like you don't say them out loud. I've kind of split the difference, and a number of other Reform congregations do that as well. Rabbi Hoffman said about Shema, and this also goes into the whether or not you stand for Shema or not, is that again in the Reform, in the classical Reform understanding of who we are, what we believe in, and a censoring in and censoring out, Shema became very important. It became the watchword of our faith, as the rabbi of my childhood used to intone with deep baritone voice. And so it became our proclamation of this is what we believe in. So not only did we say it out loud, and the second part out loud, but we stood for both. Now, there's been an ongoing debate within Judaism, and in fact that reform idea of standing for Shema, that's a recent development, because we go back to the classic arguments between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai from almost 2,000 years ago. And they had a passionate debate about the way that you said Shema in the morning and the evening. And Shammai, as usual, tended to be very literal. The house of Shammai tended to be far more literal than the house of Hillel. And they said, well, it's very clear that it says in the text, when you lie down and when you rise up. And therefore, so in the evening for Shema, we should say it seated, or some of them went to the extremes of saying lying down. You should physically lie down when you say Shema in the evening. And in the morning, Kumecha, that's meaning you should physically stand up and say it while you do that. House of Hillel said, no, you guys are being way too literal. This is referring to the time of day that you say the prayer. It's not talking about the actual physical position of your body while you're saying this prayer. And then there's this little anecdote that's part of this discussion, which I love to quote because it's a good reality check and a good reminder to us all that, yes, these ancient rabbis that we hold in such reverence, they could get pretty harsh on one another. And this one rabbi pipes up and he says, well, I was out in the countryside. I was riding from this place to this place, and it started to get dark, so it was time for prayer. So I got down off of my horse and I laid down on the ground to say Shema, and all of a sudden these bandits jumped out at me, and I just barely escaped with my life. I was lucky to get away. And another rabbi responds to him and says, if you'd have been killed, it'd have been your own darn fault for following the practice of the house of Shammai. It's like, ouch, that's not cool. That's not nice to say. Bad.
I was taught it was supposed to be your last words you said for the end of the day.
There is the bedtime Shema, where yes, as you go to bed, you're supposed to say this. Since you brought that up, I was also going to mention Shema is also supposed to be the last thing you say, right before you die. Okay? And I actually had a very powerful experience at the home of someone under hospice care who was in their very last moments of cancer. and was at their home, and the family was there and so on. And I asked the gentleman if it would be okay if I said the vidui, the confessional prayer on his behalf, because he was intubated and couldn't speak and so on and like that. And I think he gave a little nod. I can't remember. He was clearly on his way out, shall we say. And so I did that prayer for him and read that. And then I had the family come together, and I said to him, it's like, we're going to say Shema for you. And so we held hands, and his wife and his children, and there were a couple of older adult grandchildren there and so on like that. And we said Shema, and then there was pause, and we stopped after that, and we're quiet. And then somebody said, he stopped breathing. And we realized that, yes, in fact, he had stopped breathing. It was, even just telling it now, I'm getting goosebumps. And this was 25, 30 years ago. It's an incredibly powerful moment. So traditionally, you're supposed to say Shema, right, as the last thing you say before you die. Now, in the department of mysticism and gematria and things that are sometimes cool and sometimes really interesting when you see them, but are they coincidence? Who knows? I've mentioned about gematria. That's where you take Hebrew letters, which also mean numbers, and you add them up and you see what other words are related to them, and you can sometimes find some really, really fascinating things about make connections between words and ideas within the Hebrew language from this gematria. It can also be a ridiculous rabbit hole. Okay, so again, when it comes to Jewish mysticism, well, what I said towards the beginning, I do firmly believe, again quoting the Bard, that there are more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. Philosophy meaning science, this new concept. I do firmly believe that there are some things that are not explained by science and by empirical science, and that there's something more to all of this. But on the other hand, we also have to live in a world where most of what happens is governed by scientific laws. As I was at a hippie Jew retreat center many years ago, Eilat Chaim. I was in the Catskills. It was at an old, used to be an old Catskills hotel resort place, which had then been taken over by the renewal Jews, the hippie Jews. And I was having this fabulous week, and then I started to feel really lousy. And thankfully, I didn't have a car, but thankfully, one of the staff people took me to a emergency clinic place that was nearby and got me some antibiotics, because the nurse or whatever saw me, took one look at me, one look at my throat, and said, "Yep, you got strep throat." I was like, that explains why my throat feels like it's on fire. Great. So wrote me a prescription for antibiotics, which I got and started taking those immediately and so on. Now, this was at a place where I can guarantee you that there were probably a couple dozen, if not more, folks that could have done all kinds of alternative healing kinds of things for me in this moment. But as the child of a physician and a nurse and someone who knows what strep throat feels like, it's like, no, I'm going to go with what I know works really well, and I'm going to get on some antibiotics. So that being said, Shema, something you're supposed to say right before you die. Now, strange connections, coincidence, perhaps, especially considering the geography separating these two ancient cultures. In the Japanese tradition, you are supposed to compose a haiku right before you die. Okay? And this was pointed out to me, probably at one of the hippie Jew gatherings. It was probably a David Zaslow thing who pointed it out to me. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. 575. It's a haiku. As Rabbi Larry Hoffman likes to say, we have an American nigun for those kinds of connections where we suddenly realize something that shouldn't be connected at all, and then realize, wait a second, that nigun is familiar to all of you. So I've been yakking a lot. I want to open it up for some comments or thoughts. Anne.
Yeah, I had a question. You said to sit or stand, and you mentioned that it was, in a rather late development that we stand, watch where there are people and so on. I remember Rabbi Adams telling us that whatever situation you're in, if you're standing, then remain standing when it's time for the Shema. If you're sitting, you can remain seated.
Yes.
And so I wondered if you'd finish the sentence on that. I mean, our minhag is that, I guess, if we're at a point in the service that we're seated, we remain seated. Is that
right? Right.
Unless people want to stand, then they can. I mean, we're not going to stop.
The decision was that yes, you do it in the position that you are in at the time.
Okay.
And so in a traditional service, everybody stands for Chatzi Kaddish as the, which is again, doxology, and also the kind of separator between the different sections of the service. Okay, so stand for Chatzi Kaddish and Baruch Hu, and then you sit down. And then you don't stand again until the tefillah. Within a lot of Reform congregations, you stand at Baruch Hu and you remain standing through the end of Shema. I was pleased when I discovered that minhag here at CEW was that you stand for Baruch Hu and then you sit. And the first couple of services I did in the summer, I hadn't quite picked up on that until somebody mentioned it to me, and which, I actually prefer the stand for Baruch Hu and then sit down, and then, all right, take care.
The old joke.
Hmm?
You know the old joke about the new in and asks what the tradition is, and he seeks out the person who's been in the synagogue longest, and the minhag is half the congregation stands up, the other half sits down, and they yell at each other about it.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's what the tradition is. Yes,
Yeah.
that's what we do. So yeah, and so standing during Shema is a classical Reform innovation, and then but in conservative and Orthodox congregation, you sit down after Baruch Hu. So any other? I hope that answered your question. Yeah.
Maybe maybe today's not the best day, but in a future day, I know I one time when I led one of the services, it was appropriate for whatever the parsha was, but because it was a devar or a devar acher about what's all this about the bowing or something, and people appreciated that. So maybe if not today, then some other time explain and talk about the appropriate choreography for that in a service. And someone had suggested to me, but I wanted to mention it to you, and if I forgot to do that, please forgive the omission, maybe a little bit in the bulletin about bowing, or did you do that and I forgot?
Haven't done it yet, but
okay. Yeah, because I know there's some confusion, and I know sometimes it's mo bowing, mo betta for some people, and so no,
there's a lot of confusion out there, and a lot of I remember in the 90s at Green Family Camp, and it then tried to trickle its way back into Temple Israel in Tulsa, Oklahoma. There were some folks who, when they learned at camp that Ve'ahavta was technically still part of the Shema, they got it into their heads that, oh, well, we should stand for Ve'ahavta then, and they would. And I mean, Rabbi Sherman would have none of it in his congregation, but it drove him nuts when he heard about it and said, that's craziness. Where are they doing this? Where are they
You don't
getting
stand for the Torah reading either, so.
right. And bowing is oftentimes the same way. And so. Any
I
other comments?
appreciate
or
that.
thoughts?
Angst I feel in the service of God. Am I bowing now? Am I doing? It's different in different synagogues. I find the choreography. I love the idea of that. The choreography is different, and yeah. So I'd appreciate a course on when to do what.
I can speak to that, and we will be making our way into the tefillah, not too many weeks. We'll be because we're here on Shema, and so we've got Ve'ahavta to look at, which is a continuation of the Shema, obviously, and then the prayer for redemption, and then we're into tefillah section. So, Beth Ann and Lori.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure if we touched on this or not, but when we do the Ve'ahavta, I always tend to think, well, pretty much always, that God chose the Jews because we were going to pass on our legacy to our children. And I always just think that that's so significant. It's like ask my kids, I'm like a Lador Vador, like addict. So so when I do the Ve'ahavta, and I know the Hebrew, but I really enjoy reading the English because it really does remind me of the commitment that goes from way back.
Yeah, it's been a powerful part of our tradition since the beginning. Absolutely, yeah. And since you mentioned it, I'll just say you all have reshut, you all have permission that in services, if we're doing some prayer, and whether or not it's in Hebrew or in English or something, and something catches your eye either on the left side of the page or at the footnotes or something, and you want instead to pray that, go for it. That's if that's what's calling to you at that moment. I'd rather you have a prayerful moment doing that than doing whatever the rest of the kahal is doing.
I fit them both in.
Especially on the high holiness, because there's a lot in those books. Lori, you had a comment.
The synagogue we belonged to in Denver, we stood for the Shema. There was no bowing. And so coming here, it was like, huh. And growing up, I never did the Ve'ahavta in Hebrew. It was always English. So yeah, so much has changed. And I like it better now because it felt too, I'm gonna put in quotes, Christian. At the time, I just felt like, oh, well, there was no connection with it. Does that make sense? And this seems to be giving more of a connection and something that you're doing as the entire synagogue together. So you're connected to the people that you're with. And I never felt that before until coming back here.
Patty?
Yeah, actually, adding to Lori's comment, I was thinking about the choreography that Anne used that word and how lovely that is actually, although we wanted to be able to do our service individually so that it has a personal meaning for us. The cool thing about dancing, and by the way, I miss the Kadosh, 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 I always look forward to that. I miss that. There's a Kadosh and there's another Kadosh, and then you got to wait a while before another Kadosh comes around. It's not the same. but I love it as choreography, and that as even though at the risk of our over this some kind of over conformity, where there's an in crowd who knows it and an out crowd that doesn't know it. You know, aside from that, putting that aside, it's kind of neat to have this dance with the group. I think it's very heartwarming.
Yeah. And I love looking out at a kahal, especially if there are kids that have been to Osrui or some other Jewish summer camp, and we get to the Kedusha, and it's like, okay, prayer aerobics time, let's go, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh.
Kadosh. Yes.
Yeah, not having kids, Beth Ann, to hear you say Lador Vador, I may do teaching, and it infuriates me when I hear people say, well, I don't have kids in school, I don't want to pay for education. But in a Jewish context, we have a sacred obligation, a mitzvah that we should perform to educate the next generation. And so if it means teaching in the religious school or helping out in the religious school and donating to the religious school in, money or time or some other thing of value, which is one of my favorite phrases, then we should do it. And I think framing it that way, when it's time for the annual budget and time for dues, it plugs directly back into the V'ahavta. And it's something that it isn't just the annual open your wallet. It's something that we as Jews are, that's like you just said, Beth Ann, that's like one part of the prime directive, for lack of a better term.
Right.
That's what we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, and circling back to what I was talking about a little bit earlier, in a similar vein to the whole, American Jews created comic book superheroes. There was also much greater representation within science fiction writing of American Jews. Yes, Nimoy and growing up Orthodox and bringing that to Star Trek. But I've also taught a little mini course on Judaism and science fiction, and there are a lot of connections between them. And we have often been the other, and lots of science fiction has to do with the other. There's a reason why Spock was the most popular character on the original Star Trek series, because he was the other, and he also intriguingly had one foot in both worlds. His mother was human, his father was Vulcan. So, but he was clearly the other, and the most obvious other on that show. And another connection between Judaism and the ideas of science fiction and especially Trek, Star Trek, and Roddenberry's original conception, was that we look forward to a better time. And the teaching of our children is part of that. And we end every service with Aleinu, where we look forward to the day when the world will be one and your name will be one. And we have always acknowledged as a faith tradition that yes, we are going to be okay, that things will get better despite the current situation that we may find ourselves in. There will be a better time. There will be a better time to come in the future. And that's a big part of science fiction, at least if it's not of the dystopian flavor. And Roddenberry's vision of the original Star Trek was that, yes, because remember, here again, we're back in the late 60s, and the craziness of that time, and the fear and the real sense of fear that, is America going to rip itself to shreds? is America going to tear itself apart? And add to that the fear of nuclear annihilation between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a scary time. And then Roddenberry comes along with this fascinating, unique vision, and there we are. We're out among the stars, and we're there, and we're exploring. And there's even there's a multiracial crew on the bridge. And I'm sure many of you have heard, but since we just finished the birthday weekend for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Nichelle Nichols, Lieutenant Uhura, was ready to quit the show after the first season because she felt like her character wasn't being given much to do. All she did was say, "Hailing frequencies open, Captain," and so on like that. And Dr. King actually told her, no, you have to stay on this show. Do you realize how important you are to our people? Okay. You're a woman of color and you're there on the bridge. You're an officer on the bridge. And it's like, you cannot quit this show. This is you are too important a symbol. And when Dr. King tells you that you need to stay with the show, you stay with the show. So, all right, Anne.
In the chat, I put a link from Wikipedia to a show, an episode in the first season of The Twilight Zone.
Yes.
Written by Rod Serling.
Yep.
Frequently used in classrooms. It was used in the middle school I most recently taught in, but also in the previous one, called The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. And it's one of the best ones. And it's if you have never read the script or seen the episode, it has to do with unreasoning, irrational, runaway fear of the other. And of course, Rod Serling was Jewish. And again, 1960, we know what the atmosphere was like in America. And I think that if you don't already use it in your talk about the connection between, the Jewish people and science fiction, there's a good one. But no, it's a lot of his episodes, I think, are really, really good ones for illustrating our situation in the modern world. But that one particularly, I've seen how a lot of middle school teachers teach that. Some of them do a really good job with it. They often connect outsiders but it's a lot of times bullying and things like that. But some of them do a really, really good job with it. Others, me, but it's a really good episode.
Thank you for sharing. Yes, it's one of the very best of that series. And Serling said in an interview ages ago about the Twilight Zone series, he said about a third of the episodes were just trash. Another third were okay. He said, but there were about a third of those shows that were some good storytelling, some quality storytelling. So, and that one certainly. All right. Thank you all very much. Hate to disappoint you about Kadosh, but we will not be having a Saturday morning service this week. We're still, since COVID is ramping up rapidly here in
Wisconsin.
Southeastern Wisconsin.
Are you gonna do it are we gonna Zoom it, or you're not doing Saturday morning at all?
Not gonna do it. The whole point of doing it was as an alternative to a Friday night. Nobody wants to go out in the dark and the cold on Friday night in winter in Wisconsin, and therefore we do a Saturday morning service instead once a week. We are planning on doing one in February, and we may very well do one in March since we're not doing this one.
We'll have services Friday night.
Yes, there will be services Friday night
on Zoom.
Okay.
If you could write up something about what you want to say for canceling, I could get it sent out.
Sure, I'll do that. Okay.
And Lori's muted.
Wait, Lori, we can't hear you.
I have contacted Mike about what we talked about yesterday and I don't have an answer yet, so. But he's working on it,
Okay, great.
Mike,
Thanks.
so, okay.
All
Great
right.
to see you, everybody.
Thank
Nice
you.
seeing
Thank
you.
you, Stay warm.
Hopefully
See
we'll
you soon.
be
Yes,
Yes,
stay
stay
person
warm.
again soon.
It's cold out there.
Yes, stay
Okay,
Miss
All
you
right.
Take care.
all.
Bye.
warm.
Bye-bye.
bye.
Can you stay on one moment, Cantor?
Oh, sure.
Thank you, Mark. Bye.
Sure.
Bye.
Bye.
Ann. Bye, Cantor.
Did you see the note that came back from that pastor?
Yes. Yes, are you able to do the 17th?
I probably could. I'm thinking it's better to be consistent, but if you're not able to go on the 17th, I could do it.
Was I misreading that? I thought he said he
He-
wanted two sets of opinions.
Um, that's not the way it read to me, but I'll double check it.
Okay, all right. Um, all right. You're right. I guess I was reading into that in a different. All right, let me check into that.
Okay. I
Okay.
figure it's always better to have the guy who knows something.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll get you a blurb about why
Okay.
we're not having services on this Saturday morning.
That's fine. And the 17th of March happens to be Purim, but I don't
Yes.
think that.
Yeah, unless there's someplace doing something really fun for Purim, which I mean,
Generally not during the day.
yeah. All right, very good.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Mark.
We'll see you soon.
Yes, indeed. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.